need and is prepared to walk that road with us to really help those emerging farmers gain access to new markets.
More than 20 million people in our country are unemployed, are starving, and need food desperately. Food Forward SA's core business is addressing the problem of hunger, and what we do best is connecting this world of surplus or excess food with this world of need, people that need food. And we bring those worlds together to make sure that we address the problem of hunger. Through the partnership with Standard Bank and Hello Choice, we were able now to have a greater access to a larger network of farmers that were able to donate into our network. This allowed our food basket to beneficiary organizations to be much healthier. And now we're able to guarantee that more than 80% of the food we provide to beneficiary organizations is nutritious food.
Our group has decided to pivot itself towards becoming a platform business. We see ourselves as more than a bank, and One Farm Share is a perfect example of that.
With that, I'd like to please introduce our topic and our panel, Bridging the Digital Gender Divide. If I can introduce to you the moderator, Zanele Morrison, Director at Research Partners International, and the three panelists, Professor Puleng Linkabula, Principal and VC UNISA, Yolanda Cuba, Group Regional Vice President Southern and East Africa MTN, and Welele David, CFO Microsoft South Africa.
Thank you so much. I have an amazing panel, and of course we have an amazing panel of women today to talk about the digital divide. Let's talk a little bit, and maybe I'll start off with you, Welele, right next to me. What are your thoughts around technology and what we are doing right and what we need to take into account?
This conversation that we're having in terms of the dynamic from a gender perspective is so important, because unfortunately women are not represented in roles that are in tech, and unfortunately they're underrepresented in roles that are related to tech, and unfortunately are the most impacted when it comes to access and the understanding and having the skill to be able to use technology. So I'm looking forward to this conversation in terms of being able to help us understand and address the things that need to be done in order to be able to close this gap and allow women to be able to participate in this digital economy that is South Africa and the world.
Yolanda, I also think that a lot of pressure was then placed on digital organizations like yourselves, right? Because you also are a key factor in access and affordability of access. How agile do you think the telco space has been in really creating room, sacrificing and enabling the disadvantaged to have more access to data? This is a very tough conversation, and you just need to really be as honest as possible here in terms of the sacrifices that need to be made and whether you've made them or not.
I mean, as MTN, we actually have done a lot in terms of making what we call democratization of data and internet access. We actually have a program specifically called Chase, which actually deals with all elements of someone being online. And that actually starts with the connectivity layer, where we're actually consciously building all our sites ahead of demand. When the COVID pandemic actually started, remember, we didn't anticipate everyone being online. We had to change everything that we're doing in ensuring that each and every one of us are connected in a way and in a speed that wasn't actually, which wasn't planned for just 2 years ago. So we actually had to make sure that we accelerate all our 3G, 4G, and even in South Africa, you saw, we actually also launched 5G. So those are the first kind of issues that we actually looked at. And then next, we actually looked at handsets around the Chase model. Again, handsets are one of the biggest kind of discriminators, if I can call it that, in terms of people being online. And also women, by the way, because when we look at the stats between women and men, being online is actually a problem. While on devices, there's between a 5 to 10% kind of delta in most countries, with men who having more handheld devices than women. But when we look at internet access specifically, we have countries that actually move all the way to 50%, only 50% of what men's accessibility is relative to the women accessibility. So if, for example, in a country like Tanzania, it's 43% men, it is around 22, 23% women who actually have access to the internet. Even in South Africa, which we actually see as more advanced, we're actually seeing a 10 percentage point difference between women and men that are actually accessing the internet. So that is another element that is key that we've actually worked on, in creating environments and creating devices, device financing, driving devices to below 20. Now that there's a chipset shortage, obviously now devices are starting to go up again. However, our key kind of role is to ensure that the prices of devices, although we are not manufacturers, we actually keep on actually pushing them down. So during the COVID pandemic, we increased our subsidies in devices so that more people are actually online, as well as actually increasing our partnerships in terms of device financing. And then if we look at the next layer, which is affordability, right? This is the point that you were talking about, the data must fall kind of movements and so on. The reality is, from a data costing perspective, we must probably have been the most consistent as telcos in driving the price down. What you could get literally like 2 years ago for $10, it's more than doubled now. So we actually operate in a deflationary pricing environment. While everyone else actually can take price increases, we really cannot in many of our markets, because literally everyone is saying, this is like oxygen to us, and therefore we need the cost to actually come down. We created specific bundles last year for data specifically in order to facilitate people being able to afford data bundles. We partnered with universities, including UNISA and others, to actually say, how do we create data bundles for school children as well as university students that actually make it easier for them to access their online content.
Sisipuleng, I think UNISA being a correspondence university, what is your thought around helping people from a knowledge perspective to bridge their own digital gaps?
I must start by saying, as a Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, we observed that the locus of our teaching and learning, research, engagement, and global impact relied on the postal services in the past. However, with the advances in digitalization and the 4.0 industrialization, it became imperative that we accelerate digitalization, technology acquisitions, but also the knowledge that undergirds technologies. In the main, countries in the global south tend to talk about technologies or digitalization systems from the perspective of consumers, where we are not at the forefront of constructing or co-constructing the devices, but also the technologies that we're using. At UNISA, we recognize that for us to ensure that we track and trace our students and understand their success rates, it was imperative that we have people who had strong understanding of high computing, artificial intelligence, but also radio frequency identification expertise. This is very important because the idea is not to work as a consumer, but the idea is to ensure that the knowledge base is equally accessible. This is important because the key drivers of knowledge devices or products are generally located in the global north. And if you look in the global south, it will be just China and Korea in the main that are the dominant or hegemonic participants. So that's very important. However, I'm of the view that for drone technologies, it's very important that we start training women to mitigate the gaps that the gender hierarchy and patriarchy is producing. Many do not have licenses, and even though there are possibilities for applying drone technology into the health system, the education system, surveillance systems in order to ensure safety, including gender-based violence, we haven't given the time, but also invested the necessary opportunities, financing to ensuring that licensing systems, or at least access to such knowledge by women, is evident, is available. But it's also equally important that in terms of the skewedness of distribution of knowledge base, that artificial intelligence bots and their implications for financing systems, whether in the speculative or in the banking systems, where a majority of women have found it quite easy to participate, whether they're in the small, medium, but also in transnational business enterprise. So I'm of the view that we must invest in the knowledge base. We must ensure that as we invest in people who are accessing the technological systems, that women ought not to be left. The intergenerational discussions must be entailed. The issues around disabilities and people living with disabilities, which Yolanda has already raised, are quite important. And the partnership between higher education systems, telecommunication company, and inventors is quite an important area that we need to emphasize on in order to ensure that we mitigate these gaps in access, but also in utilization and knowledge base on the technological revolution.
So let's go back to the question. I think, Walela, we spoke about your own journey into technology, and this must be new as well, even for Microsoft itself. But why are we shy to speak about what is required for women by women when it comes to technology?
One of the challenges, I think, is around just even the data transparency. I think when we look at, when it comes to the notion of being able to measure digital adoption and kind of who's digitally literate and so forth, we tend to look at the data from the perspective of the population as a whole, but I don't think I personally also just haven't seen a lot of transparency in that data in terms of looking at it from a gendered perspective. So unless the data is out there to support it, and there's transparency where one can benchmark different countries against one another, or companies, it's hard to then have that conversation and to drive that accountability, and for you to be able to then set the goals necessary to drive that progress that's needed. And so I think part of it is, this is also a world and a space that's just evolving very quickly, and it's moving very quickly. And so I think to then pause and have that conversation about gender, I think sometimes gets overlooked, but I really truly think it starts with ensuring transparency of that data and then setting goals so that one can be held accountable to achieving those goals.
And I think also the transparency that's authentic. I think a lot of organizations say what you've said, but then you find that the experience of women is not an inclusive one. It's not one of equity. It's not one of proper participation. One of the things we're going to be speaking about, and I'm hearing in the different platforms as well, is the fact that you and Yolanda in the corporate space have landed where you are. You have received certain things that are still privileged to many, that a lot of women don't get. They don't get the support. They don't, have those sponsors. They've got a lot that works against them. So the playing field for women allows a few to rise because the formula is just right, but it's just right just for them, versus it being something that is actually afforded to everybody, as it is afforded to a lot of men. And I speak to a lot of executives, and I see the opportunities that men get granted, but so few of those opportunities get granted to women, even in the corporate space. And if we don't have more of you, it means we have less of a voice to infiltrate how things get done, and how therefore women, even in society, start to benefit from environments like yours. So we don't want to pay lip service to it. It has to live in the system. And Yolanda, if you had to choose what lives in the system at MTN that should maybe live in the system at MTN, so you can separate yourself, you can say what should be in any system to enable women to thrive and to participate well enough and to be able to survive and stay in senior roles so that we can start to make a difference? What would that formula be? What should go into this cake to make us cope and stay in the race so that we can have an impact on technology?
Yeah, so, I mean, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we're actually getting women around the table. So the more of us that there are around the table, the better. So the first one actually starts with what Welela actually talked about, which is around commitment, and then measuring that commitment. And then you're using it as a goal for the organization to actually achieve. As MTN today, we're sitting at 38% women representation as we sit today. And we've actually made a public commitment to say we actually want to reach 50-50. However, in technology, we know this is difficult. You know, I mean, if we look at the education side of the STEM subjects, right? It's still less than 30% of women who are actually going into engineering and mathematics and actually ensuring that they actually join the workforce. On average, about between 25 and 30% of women are in technology. So that's the biggest kind of crack, something that we actually have to crack. We actually have to start with our commitment, not only in the boardrooms, however, before the boardrooms. How do we get more and more people interested, and women in particular, and girls interested in STEM? So the education part becomes important, and so on. The second element is around pay parity. Around pay parity, I mean, we see the data. It tells you somewhere between 15 to 20% or 17%, they normally say, 15 to 17% kind of pay disadvantage towards women in general. This actually gets even worse within the technology space. So when you start looking at that data, it becomes very clear that this is not something that makes the industry actually attractive. I mean, if you think about it, about 61% of women actually are paid at less than median, whereas only 37% of men are paid below median at an executive level. So if we are not addressing that, then we are not actually going to attract the right kind of people also to stay within the profession of engineering, science, technology, and the likes. So if we get those two components right, then we are going to be on our way to starting to address the problem. And then from an HR policy perspective, you know, we can't sit today and have a short list that actually of potential people for a position, right, that does not have a woman. We actually have to keep on insisting that there is a woman. If that woman actually is in Timbuktu, everyone must go and find that woman and make sure that woman is actually in the position. In South Africa, 27 years later, you know, you still hear comments like, we can't find a CFO, we can't find a non-technical person. I'm like, no, that is impossible, right? We've been free as a country for 27 years. And by the way, there were people qualified before the 27 years. So we do actually have a pool of people. It is about actually being deliberate about trying to find the individuals that we actually want to actually appoint to these key positions. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who always says to me, Yolanda, we have to grow our own timber as a business. He's an HR specialist, and he says we have to grow our own timber. And while we're growing our own timber, make sure that we actually plant more trees than what we require. Because if we're being deliberate that actually technology is going to be a catalyst for economic growth, then as a country as a whole, not just as one company or a collection of individual companies, then we as a system, as a country, as a society, then should be willing to overinvest in these capabilities so that we can actually get the depth of skill and the depth of knowledge that we actually require in order to actually make an impact within the space.
If you don't mind, I'd love to just to add, I completely agree with everything Yolanda shared. And I think another important element around it is also around mentorship. I think the power of being able to mentor, especially young girls, is important because it's planting the seed and that sparks the curiosity, the interest, and the pursuit. And it's what can help someone eventually envision what the possibilities are for them. And I think having more women who are role models, who are have the opportunity to be exposed to, you know, I think sometimes it's hard to envision a path of what's possible for you, or the art of the possible, if you can't see an example of it. And so, you know, women like all of us have to do our part in order to, you know, reach back and pay it forward and help women and young girls and pull them along. But I think the power of mentorship is super important, because I think it plants that seed of curiosity and interest that gives someone the sense of entitlement to pursue a certain path. And then having role models out there that can break this illusion of there actually being a glass ceiling. Because if Yolanda has gotten into the role that she's in, and, you know, if I've gotten to where I am, it's certainly possible for other young girls and women to get to where we are as well.
And I think what's also remarkable about the spaces that you've gotten into is, and what we need to see more of, is we need to see more variety of women in a variety of roles. This clustering of women, look at all the nodding of the heads. You know, this clustering of women into, or even Black people in 2 or 3 roles in the whole of Exco has absolutely got to come to an end. And I mean, I don't think that's the case at MTN, but if you look at the broader corporate, no, it's not. But if you look at broader corporate SA and Wilela, you can speak to other markets, is we keep on only saying that women are rising only in particular industries. So where there isn't a Yolanda, where there isn't a David, a Wilela, it means that they've got nobody to look up to. They've got, and therefore the prejudice to keep them down is that much stronger. So you speak of mentorship, and I think it is absolutely critical. But there's so few of you as well, you know, so it's quite overwhelming, right? There's so few women sitting in senior leadership position. Now they're responsible for mentoring so many people. And if you've made it, your biggest challenge is staying in that role. You know, your biggest challenge is also staying in that role, because it doesn't mean it's become easy just because you've arrived. So we're putting a big burden on very few people. And I don't think, Professor, you probably are qualified to answer this, but really, Yolanda touched on it. There has to be a much bigger focus by institutions, by government, to change things at the bottom, in the middle, in policy, in regulation. What are your thoughts on whether we have the appetite to do this, and if we're doing it at all?
It is my contention that institutions have not generally been open to ensure they enable women to participating optimally in the diverse sectors, whether corporate or even higher education. In the context of South Africa, we only had vice chancellors, women vice chancellors in the early 2000s at CPUT, at Vaal University of Technology. These were the predecessors of women CEOs or women vice chancellors. The issues that I think as women we have to do, I draw on some of the wisdom of mentors like Nolita Fakude, who says, when we come into institutions, we ought not ask the questions whether we came as affirmative action, but we should actually do our best to demonstrate women's potential, women's intellectual abilities, but also women's leadership in transforming institutions. And one of the metaphors she uses is that when she took over the Black Business Association, people said, oh, you're going to fit huge shoes. And she says, no, I don't have to. I've brought 10 pairs of shoes, high heel sneakers, and they all do varied systems. The point here is to say, let us work towards ensuring that policy enables us to ensuring that women overcome the challenges of patriarchy, hierarchy, and the idea that women must perform particular roles. The second aspect is that I, in my own context, give many women the opportunities to act sometimes in the roles they would not deem themselves fit to participating as part of exposure, understanding university systems, decision systems, and policy-making systems. And oftentimes, they discover the talents that they never thought they had and are able to run with the baton. In the context of technological systems, I think we cannot flourish if we only do not leverage the knowledge base as an important input into transforming the technological base. As I stated, there are multiplicities of areas of specialization in technologies, not just as consumers of devices. So how do we rally around and ensure that we expose women to the manufacturing of devices, to artificial intelligence knowledge through either creatives? Because for us to understand predictive systems, we don't just have to be in STEM, but we could have the resources of logic, of knowledge that enables us to doing so. The issues, for instance, around the translation in innovation systems of particular inventions for agricultural purposes, for health systems, for education, require us also to be deliberate around exposing multiplicities of women in their diversities to possibilities in those areas. And one of the critical areas that I often think we do not look at its futures is the issues of energy. Energy is one of those areas that we must invest in teaching many women to acquiring skills, because your artificial intelligence, high computing, robotics will not function when energy systems are not available. And that's one of the areas of challenge in South Africa, which may derail the success of women's participation in the digitalization systems. The last aspect that I think is very integral for overcoming the digital divide is for women to always frog leap, because we tend to want to be in the technologies that are vogue. But sometimes it's important to aspire to the future, to ensuring that we become a little bit crazy around our ideas in order to get to those spaces that women are often not allowed to. And therefore, universities are often willing to engage with telecommunication companies. In the current context in South Africa, we engage with telecommunication companies as consumers of the digital and data. But my sense is that we could do better if we don't engage as consumers, but as partners in ensuring that the technical knowledge base, that we don't come to telcos for corporate social responsibility, but partnership in research, in inventions that catapult the contribution of women, but also the contribution of South Africa to the global technological arena, lest we come as beggars in the global digitalization system, something that I would not want to contribute towards.
I'm going to take that as your closing remarks, Professor, because we only have a few more minutes to go, but I want to give Yolanda and Welela a chance to close off for us. And I would love for you to inspire women. This cannot be just on your shoulders. We all have to be doing something. We have to be either building mentorship circles. We have to be getting into industries and creating access. I'm speaking to women all across the world who are, all across the globe, who are running initiatives that are saying we're opening up opportunities and we're focusing on women in media, we're focusing on women in financial services. So what would you say women should do to help you to carry this load? And let me go to you first, Yolanda, and we'll finish off with Welela.
Thanks for that, Zanele. I mean, I guess the first thing that we must actually realize is that COVID, although it actually impacts us equally, whether men or women, it actually has very unequitable outcomes. And the unequitable outcomes are then the result of, the consequence of which is the things that we're actually seeing. It's exacerbating the differences and the disadvantage of women, and also, by the way, of people without means. So we see that in education as well. We see it in all areas. I mean, kids like yours and mine continued with school, while other kids actually were not able to continue with school because they don't have access to devices, they don't have access to digital education. And those consequences will stay with us for a mighty, mighty long time. So it is up to us to actually change it. And when I say us, I mean collectively, women and men. So we have to actually play our part in ensuring that we are part of the solution.
Welela, over to you.
First of all, thank you so much for the conversation. I mean, again, I want to emphasize the power of mentoring. And I also do want to call on men. Men need to get involved. Women should not only be seeking other female mentors, we can be mentored also by men as well. And men have to be intentional about this and be accountable, because they are a part of the solution. It shouldn't only be shouldered by us. This is a responsibility that everybody has. I think the other thing also that when I think about this is around just, we've got to be very conscious also about stereotypes and how engendered stereotypes actually are, and how they also shape and influence, what young girls think is possible for themselves. And so us being very conscious and aware of the stereotypes and sort of the influences that we have on the youth, and being conscious about how we choose our words and what we expose kids to, and not getting caught up on what girls should be exposed to versus boys, I think is absolutely important. And I think the other aspect of it also is really encouraging lifelong learning, whether it's through these massive open online courses, or even me as an example of just making this shift in career and going from very traditional infrastructure space to throwing myself into ICT, where I'm really learning from scratch about a whole new space that is new to me. But having that opportunity to take a chance like that and take some of my own skills that I've developed and built over the past 15 or so years and apply them into a new industry, where now I'm starting to figure out how to carve a space for myself and then see what impact I can have, I think is important. So I think this growth mindset and this emphasis on continuous learning that I think we all individually should have for ourselves, I think is quite important as well.
We have run out of time, but it's been an absolutely amazing conversation. All the best to you in your particular journeys. May you really thrive. You are going to love the technology space, so make a difference for all of us.
So what's with banks and these fancy new cards?
Fancy card.
Making some people think, Abo groot man, all of a sudden.
It declined.
I never must got this on my heart. Black card declined.
What's the point of having a fancy new card with all sorts of hidden costs that you can't keep track of?
Maybe I can sanitizer.
Then when it comes to paying, dololo. Angeke balunge ngeMimo Plus. You only have one fee, so you always know what's happening in your account. And you earn UCount rewards points every time you use it.
You don't learn, eh?
Ah, nee, also I can get you on wait.
I ask you. But anyway, good luck, just.
Yeah, nee, babu ile bat work. Asio.
Open yours at standardbank.co.za today.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So heading towards the end of the sessions for today. Remember, we're still back with you tomorrow, so this is certainly getting a lot of value kicked into one day, I must say. It's been really, really interesting. So let's just have a look. This is our second last panel discussion, what we've got for you. In fact, not really a panel discussion, it's a fireside chat. And the topic is the journey to 50-50 by 2030. And once again, let me hand you over to Vuelwetu Dubese.
It's normal for girls to be weaker than boys. Normal for guys to be told how real men should behave. For black girls to be suspended from school because of their hair. And for children to die from preventable diseases. It's normal to test on animals to assess safety. For plastic to pollute our oceans and for forests to be cut down. It's normal to be told what beautiful looks like. But is it normal? We say no. We won't accept a world where any of this is normal. So we're removing the word from our products and advertising to help build a more inclusive vision of beauty. But that's not enough. We won't just do less harm. We're committed to doing more good. We will enhance the lives of 1 billion people by taking action to improve health, hygiene, and well-being. Build body confidence. champion inclusion. And fight for racial and gender equality. And we will protect and regenerate more of the planet than we use for our beauty products. That's 1.5 million hectares of land, forests, and oceans. Say no to normal. Say yes to positive beauty.
The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a bold action plan adopted in 2015 by all member states of the United Nations, encompassing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, further broken down into 169 targets to be met by 2030. And Jade, I'm going to start with you, and particularly your response to this theme of the journey to 50-50 by 2030, and what it means in your role as an HR director at one of the largest corporations and organizations in the world.
Afternoon, Voyo. Firstly, thank you for having me to be part of this conversation today. It's definitely an inspiring agenda for us to all get behind, and really it is one that's very close to my heart. So I think maybe, Voyo, in answering your question, I'd really love to start with sharing a bit around my purpose, and sharing the link between the role that I do and this important journey of 50-50 by 2030. I think my purpose is deeply anchored in being a voice to the voiceless. And I think I'm very fortunate that in working in a global organization, which is purpose-led like Unilever, I have the opportunity to bring to life that purpose in the work I do every single day. Really, if I think about the role that I do, it is definitely one that is one that works with global leaders, it works with local teams in the market, and we're really working towards this audacious ambition of pioneering and leading the way on equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think it's one that's deeply anchored, in our business strategy and the way that we do business, and we see it as interlinked so that we can really make a difference to drive innovation and business performance. But it's really one that we also want to use to touch societies, to touch our consumers. Now, if I think about journey to 50-50 by 2030, it's a journey that we've been on as Unilever for many years now. Of course, we look at gender equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as many other intersectionalities, being LGBTQIA+, race, disability, etc. But I think this journey of gender transformation is one we've been on for many years, like I mentioned, and I'm very proud to share that we've actually been gender balanced at management in Southern Africa since 2017 and in Africa since mid-2020. I think critical to what you've mentioned is it's not just about representation across the organization, but it's around what does your representation look like at the most senior levels. And I think for us, this is really a big achievement in terms of the journey we've been on. I think what's really important, though, is that it's not about the representation only, right? It is really about how do we actually create that sense of inclusion, that sense of belonging. And so that's really very much where our focus is at the moment, and how we actually tackling those systemic barriers and inequities that will achieve that.
And I think we'll definitely get into why it's not just about the numbers, because we can critique that we won't get to 50-50 by 2030, but what are the mechanisms that we're going to put in place in order to drive this purpose-led innovation and this purpose-led resilience? And speaking of which, Shanaz, the very same question to you, in that as you think about the journey to 50-50 by 2030 and the resilience term, and there's resilience in your role, and how it engages in strengthening gender justice.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very, very much for having me. This is very exciting to be part of this discussion. So I think I'm going to start off I want to first clarify something. There's because I think with COVID and lockdown, we've all been using the term resilience quite a lot. And so I think for listeners out there, I think it's important to understand the distinction between urban resilience, which is the department I work in at the City of Cape Town, and then resilience as personal resilience, where I think all of us have had to tap in quite deep and dig in and find that kind of inner strength in the last while. Urban resilience, on the other hand, it kind of has its I guess, its basis in the environmental sciences, where people looked at how after drought, after some kind of severe, storm, something like that, a natural system was able to bounce back. And more than bounce back, how was it able to thrive? And so we're trying to apply that to kind of social systems. And so, it's looking at trying to understand the systems, the systemic issues. I think what Jade kind of probably knows a lot more about in her area, looking at adaptive leadership, and just trying to thinking about a more forward-looking approach that makes our systems more adaptive, understanding those interconnections. And within that space, something that I'm deeply passionate about is women's roles and women's voices in that. We live in a very complex country. I think at times it really challenges us, when you're like trying to be South African in itself, sometimes I think it can be quite challenging. But we live in this incredible place with so much potential and so many amazing people. So in my day job, I'm with the City of Cape Town, but I have this passion project called 1001 South African Stories. And I've been running this passion project for about 5 years now. And I pretty much curate and gather South African stories. So once a month, I chat to people and I ask them, what is your experience of being South African like? And that process for me is often incredibly inspiring. I come sometimes, I log on and I'm like, oh my God, it's like 5 o'clock, or I've just had the longest day. Do I really want to do this? And then I talk to these people and I'm just like, wow, we live in this place with so much energy. It's just a question of harnessing that. But to come back to the question of women and women's empowerment and the importance of women, we have a long road to travel. I don't have any kind of rose-tinted glasses about the position or situation of women in our country. I think the three of us speaking right now come from certain backgrounds, may experience certain privilege, but how does that filter down to the majority of women in our country? And that's important, not just because it's glossy and beautiful and you can make different arguments, but because women are in essence very much the leaders in a very real daily sense. Most children live with their mothers or some kind of female caregiver. We have in our country I stand to be corrected on this, but one of the lowest rates of both parents being registered on a child's birth certificate, which means that it's generally a mother, which means that it is generally a female caregiver that has to interact with the state to provide services and take care of that child.
HR is usually seen as the partner to the company, and for graduates who are beginning their career journey or young women who are starting, older women who are re-entering the workforce, what critique would you offer to them that they analyze before joining a workforce, if in fact they do care about gender transformation and human capital development?
Thank you, Will. I think you're taking me back to 10 years ago at the start of my career journey, and some of the things that I was really considering starting out in my career. I think what we know now more than ever before, for both women and men in society today, is that when you are considering a prospective employer, it's not just the hygiene factors that matter at this point in time. I think everyone is really looking for an opportunity to use their voice, to really reimagine societies, to really make a difference, to uphold human rights, to drive gender equity as one area and one intersectionality of transformation that's required. But I think everyone really wants to be part of an organization that isn't going to leave anyone behind. And so in considering that and looking at that when you are considering a prospective employer, one of the things that I've found is that you'll see an organization where what they say, the commitment that they put out, and what they do, the deliberate actions that they take in how they do business, how they operate, will be so deeply intertwined, and you'll be able to see that synergy quite immediately in terms of how they do business. And really, I think when you look at organizations like Unilever, for example, where they see sustainable business as a way of driving business performance, you will immediately see that. And a couple of examples that I'd like to just share, is if we think about Unilever and the way we use our brands as a force for doing good in society, I'll talk about a local brand that's just come to mind as Shanaz mentioned. A couple of examples around domestic violence, for example, is Joko. Joko is a much loved local tea brand in South Africa. And I think one of the examples of a collaboration we've recently had in using our brands with purpose as a force for good is the collaboration with People Opposing Women Abuse, but really end domestic violence, which is such a topical, critical point for us to bring visibility to in society today. And that's just really one example, that you can look at to see how a business actually says what is important and does what is important, and that synergy between the two. And so really my encouragement to those starting off their career or re-entering into the career world is to say, look for those synergies, because it will be very easy to see that what you say and what you do are linked together in the area of transformation and putting people first.
This comes to my next question to you, Jade, in that what is it that Unilever is doing or beginning to or continuing to think about how they remodel and recalibrate their approach to gender strategies, to human development, and to ensure that women are kept visible and are at the forefront and participating at work? Because human capital is really at the center of recovery, of rebuilding South Africa, of rebuilding societies. And as you mentioned about how do we reimagine the society that we want to see. And if you can perhaps share one or two practices that Unilever has employed to ensure that the gender washing does not exist, but also throughout this journey that we try and get to perhaps over the 50-50.
Thanks, Vuyo. I think, I love this question, because if we really think about the why of what we do, it isn't about just having the right representation. It's really about how do we actually use that diverse representation to lead for equality, for equity, that Shanaz has also mentioned in her examples. But really in the work context, it's about how that spirit of diversity will really unlock inclusion, innovation. It will allow us to serve our consumers better, for example, but really make a bigger impact to society ultimately at the end of the day. And so really, I think for us, Vuyo, like I mentioned, having achieved gender balance a couple of years ago in Southern Africa, last year in Africa, I think for us, we really are starting to shift our focus away from just, like I said, tracking and monitoring and making sure the representation is there, which is absolutely critical in terms of the agenda and where we need to get to, but it's not the end state, like you've mentioned. And so for us, really, the big focus is how do we actually move some of those systemic barriers and unblock these barriers for women. It is really about how do we actually look at some of our policies, our practices, to make sure that we're eliminating bias so that we can actually feel that full value of the diverse representation that we have. And maybe just to share one or two examples with you, Vuyo, I think very much where our thinking is around how do we embed the right behaviors that will really lead to sustained momentum on this agenda. And so critical is the role of allyship. And I think for many of us, we'll see that that's critical on this journey to 50-50 and beyond. And so one of the things we've done is we've expanded on the principle of employee resource groups, which I think is not uncommon for many organizations. And so we have something called the Women's Interactive Network, which has been in place for many years now. But what we've done is we've taken that a step further just over a year ago, where we've introduced an affiliate pillar called Men as Allies. And I think really what is critical about Men as Allies is saying, how do we use those who come from a position of privilege in this case? How do we invite them in to use their voice, their influence to create the right opportunities, to create the platform, to give rise to what needs to be said when we are talking about removing those systemic barriers and eliminating bias? And so that's been a very deliberate action we've taken in the business to bring everyone along on this journey for sustained momentum.
Now, Shanaz, as we realize why the underinvestment in women's economic empowerment must be turned around, let's come to this level of strategic thinking that Unilever Unilever is also applying, and that is, how do we bring influence to governments across the country, across the continent, as partnerships, political will, public participation really sits at the center of how we think about rebuilding, and especially because the scale does not fare well for women, as you've alluded earlier.
I wish I had answers, easy answers. You know, recently, I think it's not too long ago, South Africa committed to generation equality. You know, we've made a bold kind of commitment. I really hope we come through with it. A lot of the time we have wonderful plans, but we don't actually have the resources to go with it. And I think that's where the idea of partnerships becomes really, really important. It may be that this is something that we can do, or this is a commitment the government has made, but can we get civil society actors, business, and other stakeholders to really come to the party and help, you know, make this happen? And I think that's kind of an important thing, is I really think with this issue around gender empowerment, gender equality, violence against women, you know, leadership, all of these things, we really need a whole of society approach, because it really is planning for the future. You know, we haven't really touched on the impact of climate change in our discussion yet, because that could take us in a whole that probably could take another whole couple of hours or weeks to discuss. But that's also something that's really important, is how is climate change going to impact on some of our resources, on our relationships? So that's why I think, you know, we really need a whole of society approach when we discuss women's empowerment and leadership. The second thing I'd say is that for a number of organizations, it's not, you know, and Jade also mentioned this, and you mentioned this, it's not just about the numbers, but it's about the culture of the organization and about allowing women's voices to actually be heard. I know when I was much younger and I had, you know, came into leadership positions, because you kind of feeling your way around and you're trying to copy people, you don't really advocate for yourself, nor do you really advocate for women. Sometimes you can quite honestly advocate against your own best interest. And I think that's really important then within a culture of an organization. Are you allowing people to advocate for themselves and to bring about change? Because we can't keep doing the things that we've always done. You know, you can do things like mentorship programs, intergenerational dialogues. You can do all of these things because you really do need to think about new ways of kind of approaching things, but to also have very authentic women leadership, where women can actually go, actually as a woman, I don't actually need, because I've really struggled to this point and I've been balancing these things, I don't need to make it harder for other women. I need to make it a lot easier for other women. Can we have a conversation about like endometriosis or period pain and all of these things that we don't really talk about because they're kind of uncomfortable in these organizational settings? But I think when we get to those points, that's when I think we've really experienced kind of a big kind of change at an organizational level, and I would hope at a societal level, so that we can have what we really need, and that is, I think, a society where people as individuals can bring their whole selves and can really have the opportunity to thrive and flourish.
As we wrap up this conversation, we have about 3 minutes remaining. And my question to you is, what is your message to the fatigued women, the young girls who are tuned in and need to be encouraged because they are blanketed with lack of opportunity, self-belief, the discrimination that really faces them as they journey to 50-50 in South Africa and across the continent? Jade, I'll start with you and then I'll hand over the mic to Shanaz.
Thanks, Vuyo. I think, I'd really start with firstly acknowledging really what we are facing, because I think fundamentally we all want to feel seen, we want to feel heard. And I think very often on these kinds of topics, we sometimes do want to shy away from the reality that exists, that we do still have a long way to go on this journey. So I'd first start by acknowledging that. But I think really something that's helped me, I started with my purpose when we opened up this conversation today. And I think my purpose has really anchored me along this journey, and we're not at the end point. We've still got a long way to go. And so I really lean into my purpose of being a voice to the voiceless to help me carry that resilience, different to what Shanaz mentioned earlier in terms of resilience, but really to keep that resilience on this journey, because it is going to require deliberate action from all of us. Yes, notwithstanding the role of allyship on this journey, but for those fatigued women, for those young women starting along this journey, I would really just say As we go along, there are going to be some difficult moments, and it is about how can we turn those difficult moments into a crucible moment that can really affect positive change along the way.
So, Vuyo, I'm a student of law, so I'm going to say to everyone that could be listening to this, I think it's really important for us to honestly and wholeheartedly believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. All of us have a place here. All of us have a chance to participate here and build something. And very importantly, whatever we do, we're building for each other and we're building together. And I really, that kind of motivates me in kind of my work, is that what we're doing is for each other and for a better, prosperous tomorrow.
A huge thank you to my panelists, Jade Wright, the HR Director for Finance, UniOps and Equity and Diversity and Inclusion for Africa at Unilever, and Shanaz Kasim Musa, the Senior Resilience Analyst at the City of Cape Town. A fantastic way to wrap up this conversation. And with that, I hand over back to Leanne.
And there we have it. So that's another one of those wonderful conversations that I hope you've enjoyed thoroughly. Well, before I start wrapping up with you, and we've got one more panel that we have got for you as we move towards the end of today. And this one, of course, is focusing in on medical and mental well-being, because that is of the utmost importance. And Vuyo Dubese, again, is going to be hosting that panel for us. But before I say goodbye to you, I just want to tell you about a wonderful, wonderful prize that we've got for you. So, of course, this is a great competition. And what you can win is a Boshendal experience. Now, we want to basically tell you about this prize. What it consists of is Boshendal Winelands. They've sponsored this, of course. You will then get to have a whole experience there. So it's a wine tasting. It's for 2 guests. Besides that, you have 2 nights accommodation at Boshendal. It also includes breakfast in this prize and a whole bunch of other things like lunch, dinner, and I said their wine tasting and a formal tasting, most importantly, of their premium wine range. So what we want to hear from you is, why do you think that you deserve this Boshendal experience? Why? What is it? Tell us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, what was your favorite moment from today, the first day of the Standard Bank Top Women Conference 2021? What was it? What was the highlight for you? We'd love to hear from you. And you just need to tag Boshendal in your tweet or your Instagram post or whatever it may be, just telling us why you think you deserve that Boshendal experience, which for me sounds unbelievable. 2 nights accommodation, their premium wines get to be tasted, and in one of the best wine farms that we have to offer. So I think that's a pretty good prize for telling us what you loved about today and why you think you deserve that. All right, I can tell you one thing why you deserve it. It's for your mental well-being. I think I need it as well for my mental well-being. But I'm going to say goodbye to you. I'll be with you again tomorrow. Looking forward to it, to some more stimulating conversations. There's lots ahead tomorrow. So it really is going to be another jam-packed and fantastic day. But to talk more about mental well-being, let's hand you over to Vuyo. From me, goodbye and have a wonderful evening and enjoy this last discussion.
Thank you for joining the Standard Bank Women Community for this year's Top Women virtual conference brought to you by Standard Bank. And of course, thank you to Topco for an incredible lineup. This particular panel is looking at mental health and maintaining higher standards in mental health as well as in our corporate delivery. And this is for all of us who are listening today, constantly challenged with our roles in corporate, but also making sure that we are holding all the other balls we have to hold, plus most importantly, ourselves. Glenda, you are working directly with the strategies around employees and their well-being. And then we saw COVID-19 hit, right? We never thought a pandemic would hit during our lifetimes. How has it changed the well-being space in corporate?
I must say that it's been an extremely difficult period for everyone, and even though corporates have had well-being programs in place before, it just somehow brought the well-being strategy front and center, put it right at the center of our people and culture strategy and how we engage with our employees. So it's really elevated the focus on well-being. And I think when I reflect on the pandemic, it's not an overstatement, Zanele, to say that the pandemic has had a significant impact on our mental well-being. And at the start of the pandemic, we saw people grappling with, adapting to remote working, juggling multiple roles. Then we saw the emergence of blurred boundaries between personal and professional lives, extended work hours, workload, and that all impacted our mental health, intensified feelings of stress, depression, anxiety, and, really impacted our overall well-being. And we needed to take all of that into account as we rethought and reshaped our focus on, supporting our employees, supporting our teams and our organizations through this very difficult period.
Are we much more open to asking for the help that we need in order to secure our well-being? And maybe, Navlika, that opens up for you to weigh in on this conversation.
Thanks, Anele, for that. I think there's a couple of perspectives to look at in asking that question. First, I definitely think that employers have stepped forward in terms of looking at what can they do better, what can they do more of, how can they support their employees through this transition. And wellbeing has really extended itself to incorporating employees' personal lives and family lives as well. And I think there has been much more of a recognition of that than ever before. So what wellbeing means has become a lot more fluid, and there is recognition and acknowledgement that an employee exists in their greater, broader space. And because work has moved into their home lives as well, there has to be a consideration of how that impacts an employee on a day-to-day basis. But more than that, I think that the one positive that's come out of the pandemic is that people are talking more about mental health and well-being. I wouldn't say that we've reached a point where, we've created the level of awareness where there's no stigma or discrimination or anything attached to mental health. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of creating those platforms, but at least we've stepped on a positive pathway to open up those platforms, to talk more about it, to normalize it some more, so that people can come forward and raise their hands to talk about that. But again, a lot of work needs to be done in terms of leaders, particularly creating those platforms, creating that sense of psychological safety where people can say, I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z.
What, though, for me could be a challenge, and Cassie, this question is for you, is that we were already struggling as women to put ourselves forward as strong, as capable, as confident. How does the pandemic and the whole era of being able to be vulnerable allow us still to be able to put our best feet forward without compromising ourselves?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for that question. I think as women, we've had this culture, for so long that we have to work harder, longer, we have to really fight for it. And it's been incredibly hard, to reach those pathways, to reach those goals, to be taken seriously. And a lot of it even to take ourselves seriously. I think during COVID, one of the things that it forced us to do, as we were now working from home and homing from work and looking after children and taking on these roles and having to really work so differently, is we had to find our voice. And sometimes and some days it's easier than others, where we are able to push forward, engage more, push, because it's a survival. It's been incredibly difficult as we've managed and gone through this roller coaster of the pandemic. So I think for a lot of women, we're trying to find our feet. Some women have found their voices. For other women, it's been quite difficult, especially with adjusting with remote working and having children at home, and also dealing with anxiety and the uncertainty of COVID. A lot of employees and family members have been affected by COVID. They've had COVID, been off or looking after family members, or experienced the loss of losing loved ones to COVID. And that, as we see these blurred boundaries, it starts to impact every aspect of our life. So we've had to be really intentional on what we're saying, what our goal is, what we want to achieve, because it's crunch time. And again, we've got these different spaces as women, as sometimes we've got it right, we've spoken up, we've said something, we've exerted our confidence and it's been boosted. But there's also been women that have really battled and juggling. And again, some days are good and some days are not, as we go through this, different roller coaster. So I think it's forever changing. And as women, we really just have to constantly look at and review, where are we? And almost do a bit of a check-in and even a mental health check-in to say, where are we? What is happening? What is taking up most of my headspace right now? Where am I maybe lacking or I want to grow or learn or do? And I think as women, we mustn't forget that we also have to do that. And you brought up such a good point earlier about we're not good at looking after ourselves. We've got this burden of care, and what you said, Glenda, it's okay not to be okay. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves that every single day is that we just take a moment, find our voice, and take the next step. We're often really hard on ourselves. And that's the culture of being a working mom, being a woman in a often male-dominated industry. There's just always so much more that we're having to prove and carry. So it's been interesting, and I think it's going to continue to change as we carry on. But it's definitely changed the paradigm. There's been a mind shift, which is exciting.
You corrected yourself when we talked about work-life balance, and that term I know is not used anymore, and I want you to talk to a little bit why it's not used. What are your thoughts on this new lens on well-being when it comes to balance?
You're so right. And, we chatted earlier on that about 4 years ago, we started really confronting this term work-life balance, because it's not possible. It's not possible. What it really says is that my work life and my personal life these are separate entities, and that we almost need to have an equal balance and effort and attention given to each of those. However, with work-life integration, we recognize that these things are intertwined. We are a whole person. So we don't refer to work time and personal time now. We refer to and ask ourselves, what is the best time to do A, B, C, and D? And sometimes the best time to attend to a personal matter might be at 2 o'clock in the day and not after work hours like we referred to in the past. So it's really, recognizing that. And I think for organizations, this whole aspect of workplace flexibility and adaptability then becomes so important, so that individuals are able to identify what they are wanting to excel in, and, give individuals and empower individuals to manage their own time and manage their own goals, so that we can thrive and be the best version of ourselves. So I think those are things, when we talk about work-life integration, that has been important for us. And maybe just on a very practical level, for me, what I now do is really look at building in personal goals or priorities during the day. So what are the things that I need to attend to during the day that I can't get to at night? And so I'm very intentional about that. And to your point, Zanele, that then gives me a sense of harmony. Okay, so I feel that I am my best self, and I don't feel guilty about not getting to getting to personal things during the traditional work time, like we used to, label it in the past.
If I can add to that, Glenda, I think it's also so important in the time where we're talking about a hybrid working model, and what is that supposed to look like, and how do we really measure the success of women and employees, generally speaking, working from home. And so the concept of work-life integration does become critically important. In fact, research suggests that the term work-life balance actually creates more anxiety. And that anxiety is related to, I need to keep all the balls in the air at the same time, which is not possible, as you've said, Zanele. Sometimes we have to give ourselves permission to say, it's okay if we drop a ball here and there. That's part of how we need to prioritize from a day-to-day sort of basis, and how we really show kindness to ourselves as well, and really being able to show up in a way in which we want to show up and what we sort of capable of doing. So when we talk about having these higher standards and maintaining these higher standards, I think it's also about recognizing that we need to lower the pressure that we're putting ourselves under, because there is this perception that we've got to keep it all together. We've got to hold all these balls in the air at the same time. And I think that just adds another layer of pressure to everything else that, as women in particular, that we're dealing with. So I think what Glenda says is 100% true in terms of the practicality of looking at how do we split the day into manageable pockets, and that does mean that we need to integrate work and life throughout the day to maintain an overall sense of well-being.
Sorry, Zanele, if I can also just add, and because it's such an important topic, I think also we've forgotten that we're not just dealing with our normal day-to-day. We're in a pandemic, and we all assume, and we put so much pressure on ourselves that we still have to do everything, work, home, and carry on and keep growing. But we're doing this during a pandemic where we're, just responding and reacting to what's going on. We're feeling anxious and scared. We've got children, work. So we have to also remember this work-life balance, that idea that we can do it all and, find this new normal. This is not normal. How we're working and navigating, it's not normal. And how we're feeling and how we're managing each and every day is not normal. So I think it's also just to take that pressure off is really, really important.
Everything we do with such intensity. And I think we probably do the same thing at home. We're raising kids with intensity, and we have high standards for our bodies that are intense. Is that a common thing, or am I the only one that has literally put myself through the ringer like this?
I definitely think you're not the only one. And I think just one angle of unpacking what you've sort of mentioned, there's external barriers in terms of how women see themselves, and if we look at career in particular as well, meeting those goals, there are external barriers, but there's also a huge amount of internal barriers and internal obstacles that I think we don't spend enough time talking about. So you do raise an incredibly important aspect, and I think part of those internal barriers is about the stereotypes that we grow up with. So, and there's so many that we can use as examples, boys are not meant to cry, girls must wear pink, girls must be soft and they must look pretty like mommy. And, when a girl shows leadership in something that she does, then she gets labeled as bossy. But when a boy shows leadership, then he is the boss. So it's all of those kinds of stereotypes that we grow up with, and then we try to somehow fit into these boxes, which can be so suffocating in so many different ways. And I think it's time to really challenge those stereotypes. And we have to do it in supporting one another. Really, look at the conversation that we're having at home as well. How are we showing up in the household where we're trying to still do everything? We're trying to make sure there's a hot meal on the table. We're trying to make sure the house is clean. We're trying to excel in the workplace. And we're doing all of these things to ourselves, Zanele. So to your point, and I think we've got to change that narrative. We've got to be part of that conversation.
It's easy to say, but you know, I feel that if I don't put the meal on the table, then there isn't a meal on the table. If I don't clean and make sure that every nook and cranny is clean, it's not going to be clean. I feel that, again, I'm responsible to fix things, but the rest of the world and society at large is not adjusting to meeting me halfway. So, you know, like, so again, it's my job to change my narrative, but nobody else is changing theirs to hold the fort with me, because it still needs to be, we still need to eat. Yeah. We still need to think about what needs to happen in the house. If something is leaking, it can't just be me who's thinking that something is leaking. So why am I the only one changing?
It's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of a situation as well.
Yeah. The other thing that I want to add on to is really also, and I suppose this is such an interesting conversation, but also so complex. The other thing about the internal drivers for our need to control everything. I mean, we need to watch ourselves and really curb the need to control everything and ask ourselves, you know, if the place is not clean, if the bed is not made the way I would like it to be made, will this matter in 5 years' time? So really identify those important things in life. The second but that is control. Hey, that is really letting go of control. The other thing is really to get to know ourselves. What's driving this need to be so hard on ourselves and the need for perfection? Is it our fear of failure? Is it our sense of self-worth? Do we not feel good enough? And when we are struggling with those deep-seated emotions and thoughts and narratives, it does show up in the way we, you know, show up in the world or at home. So I think it's also important to get to know ourselves and to start addressing our internal drivers for, you know, like you've referred to, our intensity about needing to do everything. And then I suppose, Navlika, you touched on prioritizing, hey, and really understanding our range of commitments and prioritizing that and recognizing that we'll need to reorder some of our priorities and commitments, and it needs to be okay. You know, this fear of FOMO or fear of missing out or fear of not getting to everything is something we need to relinquish and address within ourselves. And lastly, we need to have the brave conversations. If we are needing help, you know, whether it be, like you were saying, Zanele, something's leaking at home, that matters now. It's, you know, it's important that it gets fixed, that we actually have those brave conversations around responsibilities and roles, etc. And sometimes we don't have that because we avoid conflict and tension. So we take it upon ourselves, or we think that the other person won't do it as well as what we can. You know, so once again,
which is often the case.
Reality, or
you know, but what is this? You know, when did it get into our genes? I mean, how far back are we going? Back to caveman days here, where it is so deeply entrenched in us, we cannot shake off this lack of needing to just constantly be justifying our existence and our incredible talent and contributions.
Zanele, I want to respond to that and also add on to what Cassie has said, because I was dying to add on to what you had said, Cassie. I do think when we just, if you allow me, Zanele, to just add on, that organizations have a responsibility to also rethink and reshape workplace policies, job design, you know, build leadership capability so that leaders can create this environment of safety and compassion and environment of care. We can't only leave that to individuals in the organization to find their voice. So I think the milieu is something that organizations are responsible for, and we need to rethink that. So that was what I was dying to add to what you had said, Cassie. And then I suppose, Zanele, when I reflect on your question, and Navlika touched on it, you know, it's complex. So it's our socialization, it's the narratives that we are fed when we are young. It's all of those things, I think, that make up who we are and drive how we show up in life. So I think over and above, once again, having a systemic approach to this need for women to, prove ourselves more than men, we also need to look at, take our power back and start having those narratives with ourselves and tell ourselves that we are good enough. When we reflect on our careers, we've achieved phenomenal things. There's no need for us to, give 20 hours to a work day and neglect ourselves, because when we do overwork, it just perpetuates stress and it fuels burnout and it fuels resentment. We were talking about even juggling multiple roles. If we do not have those conversations in the workplace or with our families, we end up being really bitter and angry. And that comes out in our relationships once again, at home or with our colleagues. So, I would like to end by just saying that self-care is important. We have to make sure that we fill our cups so that we are able to pour into the cups of our loved ones, of our teams, etc. And self-compassion is at the center of self-care. If we aren't going to have self-compassion and kindness towards ourselves, then we are never going to be intentional about taking care of ourselves and, really setting healthy boundaries, and really just owning our space and saying, I'm good enough. I know what I need to do. I know how I need to get there. And I'm not competing with anyone else. I'm competing with my own scoreboard and my own goals.
Linda, what you're advising is an absolute journey, and it's not an easy one. When you take that decision, when I took that decision, I thought it was going to be a great decision, but it's so not easy to let go of the addiction that we have to this perfectionism, to this constantly achieving, and to just these high standards we set for ourselves, and we just never let ourselves lose. And I just wanted to add that it's great, but it is such a journey, and it's one that's so important. Navlika, what are some of your closing comments?
Nelly, I think this also highlights the importance of we need more role models to showcase that you can have those professional goals, you can excel in the workplace, and it's okay to be good enough as a mom and to be good enough as a partner. You don't have to be the best in every single role. And we need more role models to talk about these things and to showcase those things. Because often when women are sort of put on a pedestal around everything that they're achieving, it's painted in the light that they're just brilliant at everything that they're doing, when it's not necessarily always the case. And so together with that, just as a sort of parting comment as well, I think it's also really important, and this has been something that's guided me through my career as well, and my leadership journey as well, is really to always be thinking about what example am I setting for my children. I have 2 boys, and I often ask myself in terms of how they view the roles in the household, how they see mom coming to the party, how they see dad coming to the party. So we have equal responsibility in terms of how we're raising our children, in terms of how they perceive, because we have to break those stereotypes. And we need to be an example of that in the household as well. So I can't be taking on all of these roles if I want my kids to do better and I want them to show up better for their partners. And so if I continuously put that pressure on myself, I'm perpetuating it for a whole nother generation, and then leaving that responsibility to somebody else to try and address that all over again. So I think that's a useful way of just trying to remove some of the guilt and saying, how am I showing up in my own home, and what do I want my children to take from that as well?
Thank you so much, Navlika. Cassie, you kept on saying something which I think we're also forgetting, that these are unusual times. over and above what we are talking about, which has been in existence before the pandemic, we're now sitting in completely unusual times with unusual pressures on all parties in the house. You know, the husbands have a really tough time, the kids are having a tough time, single moms are having a hard time, single dads are having a hard time. So what was hard is now that much more, you know, difficult to navigate. And so I appreciate very much you having brought that up. Some of your last thoughts on this conversation?
Probably that this should have been another 2 hours for us to really have this conversation. But I think my challenge in ending this is that this is the start of having these conversations, because we don't have them enough. And it's really challenging everyone to go and have this at your family WhatsApp group, go and have it at your household around dinner, go do it at your next Teams meeting. The more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the more that we also role model and we learn from other role models. As women, we have to change the way that we're going. We have to change the trajectory, and that is through conversations and connecting. An important tip just that we've been really just sharing so much during COVID as SADAG is it's really important to connecting with others, ourselves, but also to take time to disconnect and taking that time out. And as women, we are allowed to give yourself permission to disconnect from the noise and the pressure. You know, mental health was important before COVID. It's really come to light during COVID and during, you know, in the workplace and in our teams is we just have to be intentional and really make it matter for ourselves and our other women so that we can change the culture and help someone else in need. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It definitely is the beginning of the conversation. In one of the other panels, they also spoke a lot about, and you spoke about mentors. We need to see role models and mentors, and maybe let's have some action items, because I'd love that. I'm gonna take the liberty to just take on more time. Is how should we be building that support in the corporate space? Because we understand and more or less have a grip on externally and at home. How do we get that support? And I think we even need help with having conversations with partners. You know, how do we have that conversation in a way where, again, we don't feel exasperated by constantly having the conversation? But how do we build a network for ourselves? And besides just that network, what else could we be doing to create emotional and mental and spiritual support for ourselves in the workplace?
And this is really great because this is how we build up that resilience, our mental health cup, and we're learning so much more. We're constantly growing. So it's almost take 5 minutes and have a look at your life and who are some of your mentors that you even want to learn from. You know, it's not necessarily the person who's succeeding or the top of the business. It could be someone who does really well at looking after their team or really well at multitasking. So take 5 minutes and have a look at who are your mentors or role models at work. Who is it at home? The great thing with the internet is you can go online and you can Google and YouTube anything and TEDx talks and Pinterest it. Open up your horizons and build that library of all these different mentors and watch inspirational videos and leadership ones. There's so much information at our fingertips, but it's about being intentional and taking 5 minutes a day. And already you're building up on that. So yes, action points is start that and create a list. Add it to your agenda where you put it in your diary for 5 minutes or half an hour every week, which is really easy to do if you get used to doing it. But make a list, because then you have to follow it. It adds to your to-do list. And often what really helps is if you tell someone else, find a buddy, chat to them, because then you're accountable and then you have to give feedback. So these are just some really, really helpful tips. Is don't let it end at the end of this webinar. You know, keep adding, keep learning, touching base. There's a lot of resources available, and you can go out and just go and Google and look online, or even internally at your wellbeing program. There's lots of resources.
Love it, love it. Glenda, did you want to add on to that?
I think just once again, thank you so much, Sonele, is also looking at the workplace. I think within the work environment, if we can create spaces and time to really have well-being check-ins. You know, we often have these check-ins where we are going through, you know, deliverables and these big audacious goals that we've all set for ourselves, but we never check in on the personal well-being of one another and of our teams. So as leaders, I think we need to create space where we have well-being check-ins with our individuals who are in our teams, but also create those spaces for conversation within our teams. So I think that would be my, you know, takeaway from this. I think the last thing, and I suppose, Zanele, it could be related or unrelated, and I'm really passionate about this. It's really holding on to hope and optimism during difficult times, you know, and one way to do that is really to watch our narrative and to use things like hope-catching language. So some of the tips or keywords that you can use when you're reframing things is at this moment, not yet, or, you know, so it's really currently I'm feeling like this, but it's not I feel like this all the time. So it's really understanding the language we use, understanding our mindset, and avoid getting into a negativity trap. And like Cassie has said, you know, find yourself a buddy, a friend. If you don't have that, you know, reach out to your wellbeing program and have the conversation. There's no need to carry this burden on our own. You know, we need to be kind to one another, and there's great strength in reaching out and asking for help.
Thank you so much. I love that. I love that positive narrative, and I've really been practicing. We've got such a broad vocabulary of words to use to express different things, and we have to be so mindful about what we choose there. So I love that example. It's something that I just also recently started. Thank you so much, Cassie. Thank you so much, Glenda. Navlika, some of your last thoughts and parting words.
I think I'm just sort of hanging on to the question that you asked around how do we get this conversation started? What is a practical way to do that? And I think that, you know, whether it's at home or in the workplace, the truth is that there are people that are struggling to have this conversation, and they do need ideas around how do we open this up? So maybe things like, what's working for you? How do you see this sort of panning out? What are some of the roles that make it easier for you to do this or not do that? So just opening up that conversation rather than keeping it just limited to how's things going your side. And you're going to get a limited answer if you ask a question in that way. So really just I'm trying to unpack it one level deeper. What are the challenges you're facing? What's working? What's not working? And again, we can do that in a way that's really not confrontational and supportive. So again, whether it's with your partner or whether it's with your manager, because sometimes we have to lead upwards as well. So the leader has a responsibility, but we also have an accountability to the team, to the organization, and to our managers, and to our families at home as well, is make that conversation a priority, because it's going to open up the doorway to continue the conversation. And it is an ongoing journey. You used the word earlier, Zanele. It is an ongoing journey. It's not going to be solved overnight. We're going to have to fight those external barriers and the internal barriers at the same time. We have to really tackle it at the same time. We can't wait for the one to solve the other. So it's a dual purpose journey.
Yeah. And I think with the pandemic, as terrible as it is on so many people, and as it has so many negative effects, it is such an opportunity for all of what we've discussed now. You know, there's never been more of a time for us to put into practice. And I look back, and I had a friend who talked constantly about her journey, you know, and I look back and I'm glad she did the work then. I was forced by the pandemic to do the work. So you've really opened up my eyes, and I hope everybody who's listening as well, our eyes to the work that we need to do for ourselves. And you've raised some very painful points as well, you know, around the narrative that we believe in that really puts us in this corner that we find ourselves in as women. And one thing I recall from Cassie there is we are good enough. The idea of us not being enough and therefore, overextending ourselves to collapse is really not healthy. So changing our narratives in our head, changing our voices in our language, and then changing the conversations we need to have. This has been an absolutely awesome conversation. I really want to thank you, Glenda. Thank you, Cassie, Navlika. It's going to be great to engage with you as well, with our audience as well. Thank you for your time. It's been amazing.
Thank you, Zanele.
Thank you so much for having us.
Wow, so that's a wrap for day one. I want to say thank you for joining the Standard Bank Top Women Summit. Thanks to our wonderful speakers, thanks to our partners and sponsors, and thank you to our wonderful host, Leanne Mannes. You were amazing. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow again for another insightful day. Have a great evening.
I always wanted.